So, this is not the typical short little story that you'll hear on this channel, but I want to share it anyway. So, I was about 14 years of age when this happened. I was in my bed trying to sleep, but as always, I was failing. My dad was in the living room trying to rock my brother to sleep. This was a normal routine for us, but this night definitely was not normal. I finally think that I'm about to fall asleep when I hear these loud knocks on our front door. It echoed throughout the whole house, and it's like 3 a.m. The knocks are then followed by a girl screaming, "Help, please, my mum needs help," over and over again. She was practically shrieking too. My dad assumes that it's some sort of a trap. They use a little girl, Dad becomes vulnerable, opens the door and easy access inside the house and so forth. So he's yelling back at her to just leave us alone through the door. This little girl then starts crying, kicking our door over and over again. And her screams still ring in my head every now and then. By this point, I'm sitting upright in my bed obviously, crying as well. I'm terrified and upset with my dad because what if she did need help? So, maybe 10 minutes go by of this continuous crying and screaming when I hear a man outside of my window, which is only a few inches beside my front door where the girl was. And I can hear him telling the girl to shut up, and I can hear him grab her and she's screaming for him to let her go. I felt sick to my stomach and I wanted to look out the window, but I was paralyzed with fear. I can tell that he's dragged her onto the street now, her screams for her mother becoming quieter the further they got away. Soon, I hear about 3 cars speed off down the street after a lot of men were yelling, I assume at each other. My parents called the police and reported everything and tried to get me to fall asleep, but I was way too scared and traumatized after that. To this day, which is about 3 years later, I think about that little girl and her mother all the time, scared of what might have happened to them. I used to want to know, but now I don't think I want to, as bad as that may sound. So, little girl, wherever you are, I sure hope that you're okay. A few years ago, I was on my way home. I usually take the bus even though I'm pretty uncomfortable with strangers being too close to me, but I have no driver's license and therefore not much of a choice. Anyway, I'm sitting there next to the window, listening to music as a man sits down next to me. I don't think much of it, but the bus is pretty full. I slide a little closer to the window so that the man doesn't come too close to me. Out of the corner of my eye, I notice that he keeps looking at me, which makes me pretty uncomfortable. So I obviously look out the window and just try to ignore him. I'm getting pretty nervous at this point, but luckily we're close to my stop. As the bus drives up to said stop, I shuffle around a bit and get up halfway. As far as I'm concerned, this is a normal social clue for strangers on a bus that I want to get out at this stop, and for them to let me get past their seat. Well, this guy doesn't see it that way. So I take out my earbuds and tell him politely that I need to get out at this stop and ask him to let me through. But he grins and says no. I don't want to push past him because he then has direct access to my body and I'm now really anxious. I think he sees it and takes up even more space so that I can't get past him. I also notice that he looks really unkempt and is about double my age. I was around 26 at this time. Also, I'm a rather petite girl and do not come across as very threatening or anything like that. So I say again that I have to get out, this time really loud so that other passengers can hear me and help in case of an emergency. And the man finally lets me pass, but still doesn't give me much space. When I finally get out and walk in the direction of my apartment, I notice that he is behind me. I get scared. It's winter, and even though it's not too late, it's really dark, and in the city, there's not much going on. I call a friend and ask if I can come to her place so the man won't find out where I live. We're on the phone all the way until I'm with her. When I finally arrive, I turn around for the first time, and the man is still there, and just looks at me and grins. In the apartment, we kept looking at the window too, but we couldn't see the man any longer. My friend walks me home later, and I haven't seen the man since then, but I'm still really nervous about having to take the bus again, and always try to be close to the driver as possible. Anyway, I don't know if any of you guys have ever been followed home like that, but when you go through it, it's a really creepy experience, especially given the strange behavior that this guy exhibited beforehand. I don't know if he was gone or if he followed me home afterwards, and to be honest, I'm still pretty scared. So, a little background. The facility I worked at was built in the 50s and remodeled in the 70s. Before it was an assisted living, it was one of those, I don't want to care for my disabled family, take them, thanks facilities. The 200 and 400 hall used to be the children's wing. The 100 and 300 hall were for physically disabled patients. Downstairs was the mental wing, 500, 700 halls. The linen room used to be a confinement room. My first experience was in November of 2015. I'd worked there for a little over a month on night shift. I was checking the med card and heard a door open and close. I thought it might be a patient, but I did a complete check of that hall and no one was awake. The next, I was down switching laundry to the dryer and heard the voice of a young boy. I couldn't hear what he said, but I definitely heard him. A patient who was a little out of it pushed the call button. I went to check on her and asked her what was wrong. She said, "Oh, I'm fine. Just tell that little girl if she's cold, she can come and take one of my blankets." The girl was described to me as being in a wheelchair with no lower legs. I passed this on to the next shift, and they said that that's pretty common down the 400 hall. My co-worker and I, we were washing some soiled bedding after a patient was incontinent. We were in the small laundry room, different from the other story, with the door propped open with a stop. As we walked out back into the hall, the door violently slammed shut. We opened the door and saw the wedge sitting on top of the dryer. I was marking off a narcotic from the med cart, and I heard a noise down the 200 hall. I looked down the hall and heard, oops, a laugh, and she heard us. It sounded like a kid to me too, but I can't be sure. I walked down the hall to make sure all the patients were okay. One of the patients had a small plastic snowman figure hanging on a door. They were like these tiny little ornaments, and both were completely across the hall and torn off their strings, and there's just no way that she could have done that. This encounter happened 13 years ago, and at the time I was 14 years old, and my then best friend lived just down the street from me, and my cousin was dating her older brother, so I spent basically every day at her place. She lived on the 5th floor of a block of flats. It had 18 floors, so more often than not, I'd just get the elevator. On this particular day, I was waiting on the elevator and it was taking a while. Not so unusual because the building had 18 floors, so sometimes you had to wait a while if other people were using it. While I was waiting, a man entered the building and stood beside me, waiting on the elevator also. Again, not too odd, but something about this guy had me really unnerved. I can't say what about him made me uneasy looking back, as he seemed like just a normal guy. He looked to be in his late 30s or 40s with short dark hair, medium height and build, short beard and dressed well enough, but something just seemed off. I could feel his eyes on me as I continued to wait for the elevator. I'm a girl and I've always been small and looked younger than I was. Back then, I was lucky if I was even 5 foot, and I looked about 11 or 12. I've had stranger danger and how dangerous people can be drilled into my head since I was little, and while it seemed silly to be terrified of a random man just waiting on an elevator, same as me, I decided to listen to my instincts. And it was the best decision that I have ever made. I casually walk to the stairwell, which is around the corner from the elevator. I walk in, and the second I'm out of sight, the door closed and I begin to run up the stairs as fast as I can. Now, back then, I was fairly athletic. I did a lot of sports in my free time, so it didn't wind me too bad to run up those stairs. About halfway up, though, I hear the stairwell door slam open and footsteps running up the stairs too. I paused for a second, and terrified, looked down the stairwell, only to see the face of the guy staring up at me from 2 floors below, just before he begins to run up them. I run as fast as I can up the remaining floors, my legs burning from how fast I was running, barely able to catch a breath. I finally get to my friend's floor and exit the stairwell, and I get to her door and begin to pound on her door, crying and begging her to let me in. She opens the door confused, and I run inside, slamming the door behind me. So, there I am, crying and shaking as she gets the story out of me. Her older brother, who was a 20-year-old guy and built really big, heard all of this as he'd come out of his room to find out what the commotion was, and he charged out of the flat and began to hunt the building for the guy, but he didn't find him anywhere. I never saw the man from the elevator again after that, but I'm pretty sure I know what he wanted and planned to do with me if he caught me, and I'm sure glad that he didn't. This happened a few years ago when me and my brother were both still living at home. There had been a rash of break-ins in my area in the weeks leading up to it, and several of my neighbours had been broken into. My mum had been at work all day. It was around 10:30, the time that she normally arrived back. I was in the kitchen and my brother was in the living room on an exercise machine, and I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening, then closing, and assumed that my mum was back. I waited in the kitchen for the door from the hall to open, or for her to call out or something. But neither happened. There were no further sounds. When a minute went by, I went out to check and found no one there, and no car in the driveway. I assumed that my mum had arrived home, then immediately gone back out for some reason. This had happened before, actually. My brother, who also heard the sound, thought the same thing. Over the next half hour, I found myself thinking, imagine if it turns out that it wasn't her, and an intruder had been literally meters away from me, on the other side of the hall door. Fast forward a little later, and my mum arrives home, and of course, it hadn't been her the first time. All 3 of us collectively freaked out when we realized that while my brother and I had heard the door open and close, indicating that someone was entering the house, we hadn't heard them leave. A quick search of the house revealed, however, that we were panicking over nothing. No one was there. Our theory, though, is that the intruder opened the door and maybe stepped into the hallway, then heard my brother on the exercise machine and hastily noped out once they realized the house wasn't empty. We filed a police report and got a locksmith in, who told us that the front door lock that had been installed back in my grandparents' day was hilariously ineffective, and anyone with the slightest burglary experience could waltz into the house whenever they wanted. Apparently, you could almost open the thing without any tools. That's how easy it was. Needless to say, we got all the exterior locks changed, bought an alarm system, and basically sealed the place like Fort Knox. But the creepiest element of this became clear only in hindsight. See, in the days immediately prior to the break-in, there had been a number of odd incidences. I thought I had heard someone trying the back door handle late at night. A dog had freaked out for no apparent reason, and we had found a cigarette butt on our front doorstep. None of us smoked. We now think that the house was being cased, and whoever did it might have missed me and my brother's presence and concluded that the house's only occupant was a single woman who worked long hours. To this day, I'm glad that I didn't open that hall door and meet them face to face. So, I remembered this incident after listening to some stories here, and damn, does it terrify me to think of what could have happened. My mother and I were living in a townhouse with her current boyfriend at the time. I was perhaps 15 or 16. I slept upstairs. Mum's room was upstairs, and the basement was semi-furnished with a bed and a couch and a TV and stuff. And that was where her boyfriend had his kids sleep when they visited. My older sister was living with roommates about a 30-minute drive away or so. This is important to the story because she was taking college classes. So, as per any weekday, I would wake up, get ready for work. I worked at a kiosk in a nearby mall, selling glasses and weird clothing and stuff. My mum at this point was still asleep, and I went downstairs and noticed that the basement door was open, and the back door was unlocked too, as well as food packages out in the kitchen. I assumed that Mum's boyfriend forgot to close the basement and someone just made a mess in the kitchen or something, which was strange though. My mother was a clean freak and a crumb would cause her to freak out. So I cleaned it up, made breakfast and just went to work. I get a phone call on the bus ride there though from my mum's boyfriend. "Hey, was your sister sleeping in the basement?" I was like, what? Why? That makes no sense whatsoever. Why would she be at our house? She doesn't even have a key. No one let her in. Well, not that I know of anyway. I tell him this, and he goes, "Well, who's sleeping on the couch downstairs then?" My heart pretty much fell straight out of my chest. He goes on to tell me that there's some articles of his clothes missing, which means that this person went into my mother's room at night, took these things, fed themselves, let my dog out of the living room. It was blocked off at night with the dog there because he had a bad habit of taking nosedives down the basement if the door was open, and slept in our basement. Mum's boyfriend eventually went to work, leaving my mother at home with this stranger who had walked around our house apparently, took our things, and who else knows what. Needless to say, I was having a heart attack at work. I couldn't concentrate, and I totally freaked out on the phone. He told me to stop being so dramatic because the guy didn't do anything. By the time I got hold of my mother, apparently the guy was gone. There was a rumpled blanket on the couch downstairs, the food I cleaned up, boyfriend's clothes, the missing ones. The boyfriend told me that the guy must have been drunk and got the wrong house or something. But then, how did he open the door? I assume, and still do, that it takes some focus to break into a house door, right? Focus that you probably don't have when you're drunk. It wasn't broken, just unlocked, so obviously someone picked it. We're very lucky that this guy didn't do anything to any of us. He didn't get violent or anything like that. But the things that could have happened scare me to think about. My husband and I are amateur mushroom hunters. 3 seasons out of the year, we spend weekends in forests, along nature trails and rivers, looking for edible and interesting wild mushrooms to harvest. Springtime brings the most exciting hunt, which is for the highly coveted morels. We know of a special stretch of shoreline along a river that has a few dozen morels each year. It's difficult to get to as it's off the proper path and you have to do quite a bit of ducking and climbing and maneuvering to get through. One day 2 years ago, we were doing just that, making our way slowly and searching carefully for the mushrooms hiding in plain sight. We were so preoccupied with our task that we don't know how long that we were being watched or followed, but at one point, we saw a man up ahead of us, looking at us and not saying anything or moving. Almost like he was waiting to be noticed or something. My husband saw him first and turned to shoot me a look, because we never encountered anyone in that spot before. It was beside a small and fairly busy park, but people didn't stray from the paved walk paths much. There was a weird energy about this guy too, that can be best described as vaguely menacing. We were near the end of where we wanted to look anyway, so we turned around and started working our way back. And when we looked behind us a few moments later, the man was gone. We wrote it off as some weirdo, maybe a homeless guy whose territory we had wandered into or something. We continued looking over the spots that we had already covered in case we missed any, with me in the front and my husband right behind me, looking back every few paces as we were feeling pretty paranoid as we went. All of a sudden, I look up from the ground at my feet, and the man is blocking our path, up maybe 30 feet away. He had to have left the riverbank and crept alongside us on the path, getting ahead of us in order to cut us off at the pass like that. I whip around with huge eyes at my husband, who looks over my shoulder, sees him and starts to move up the hill on our right. The river was on the left, grabbing my hand and pulling me with him. Adrenaline shot us out of the thick brush and onto the paved path with open park moments later. Without speaking, we broke into a sprint towards the direction of our car, several blocks away. The road construction prevented closer parking. When we were far enough away from the riverbank to risk a backward glance, we saw the man emerge from the brush. He just stood there, watching us leave, motionless. We speculated the entire ride home what he wanted from us, knowing that it was surely nothing innocent. To this day, it still bothers me, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd been spread apart further while we hunted, or if either of us had been alone that day. So a little over 1.5 years ago, I had a neighbour with a disturbing past. We're the same age, and he came to me one day asking for advice. I didn't turn him away. I like to try and help people where I can. I don't want to specify too much of what those problems were, but fast forward a week and I get a loud knock at my door. I open the door and he pushes me aside and staggers into my house with a bottle of liquor. I told him that he should have asked before he just came over. I'm very busy and I don't get home till 5 p.m. from work. He starts crying about how he wants to try and end it all. An ambulance showed up at 3 a.m. a month prior, so I think that he was telling the truth, and I let him vent. I felt bad and didn't know if he had any friends, and I knew that he was always cooped up in his house. He started ranting on about all the problems that he has and how he sees things and hears things in his mind. After a while, I started to feel like he was putting all this responsibility on me. Apparently, he did try to end it all because his boyfriend from Canada he met online broke up with him or something. He showed me messages and I could see how manipulative he was. he said some really disturbing things. The boyfriend seemed genuinely concerned too, and overwhelmed. Pretty much, I tried to be as careful as I could, so I didn't say anything to trigger him. He asks to go to the bathroom, and after 10 minutes, I started to wonder what was taking so long. I checked on him, and he was passed out on the floor. I got kind of upset at this point. This person that I barely knew barges into my home, throws all their problems and fucked up shit on me, and then passes out of my bathroom. I tried waking him up, and he wouldn't budge. This guy is average height, skinny, and I was able to wrap his arm around my neck and drag him from my house. I left him at his house, and he started to come back knocking on my door every day after this. I wouldn't answer it because it was just a bit too much for me at this point. A couple of months go by, and one day, I noticed one of my potted plants in my backyard was broken. I kept this plant on the grassy part of my backyard. I have a small portion that's concrete. The pot was on the concrete part, in front of my sliding door. Now, I have had severe anxiety for a couple of years now and take meds to help, but this was triggering some uneasy feelings. In the morning, leaving for work, he would run out of his house in his pajamas trying to start a conversation with me. At first, I assumed that it was probably a coincidence, but after a couple of times, I began to feel like he was sitting in his living room, staring through his window and just waiting for me. I even started running to my car every morning. I woke up an hour earlier because I was scared to run into him again. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder in my own neighborhood where I should feel safe. The day where things became really bad, I got home from work an hour earlier than usual. As I'm pulling up, I see him sitting on my porch, and I got angry. I was fuming, in fact. He knew that I was avoiding him. He knew that there was no way that I could avoid him if he was sitting in my front door, waiting for me to get home. I clutched the pepper spray that I have hanging on my keychain and called my mum. She was on the phone with me while I was walking to my house, and I felt my heart jump out of my chest. This smile just forms across his face, and he says, "You're home early?" I held the pepper spray in front of me and told him to fucking move. I said that he had no right to intrude, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with his problems. He got up and slowly walked away, didn't say a word. I locked my door and my mum told me that she was coming over. We decided to go to the cops after this, and I tried to file a restraining order against him. But despite all the events I explained to the cops, I didn't have any physical evidence that he was stalking me or intended to harm me or anything. They said that as long as he doesn't physically assault me, that there isn't much that they can do. I felt trapped. I felt really scared, angry. How could this person make me feel trapped in my own house? I spent the next 2 weeks at my mum and stepfather's house. I was too scared to sleep in my home by myself. I got a text message from an unknown number, and it was him. It was one of the longest messages that I've ever received. It described how he thought we had a connection, how I deceived him and I'm vain. It was really intense. He even threatened to end it all again and said it would be my fault and I could be happy, that the world doesn't deserve him. I'm too smart for this world and it doesn't deserve me. You don't deserve me. I woke up my mum and boy, was she pissed. We drove to the station that same night and showed the cops the messages that he sent me, hoping that it would be enough proof at least to give me a temporary restraining order. We told them how he's been Baker acted numerous times, and how I felt that he was a danger. After that, they started to take my situation more seriously now and were able to obtain his records. He does have some minor offences, mostly related to endangering himself and one for exposure. After this, I was granted a temporary restraining order while they continued to investigate. My stepdad stayed at my mum's house, and she came to live with me temporarily. My job is too far from my house, so it was just easier to be home. One night, I was trying to fall asleep when I felt a glare in my eyes coming from the cracks of my window blinds. I squinted to try and see what it was, and it went away. I felt myself getting close to an anxiety attack after that. The light turned on again, and I heard banging on my window. It went on for a good 5 minutes, and I was too scared to look through the blinds, but I knew it was him. It had to be. I ran to the guest room where my mum was sleeping and cried like a baby. The next morning, I went yet again to the police station and told them what happened. I had a police officer escort my mum and I home, and they went to speak to my neighbour face to face while we waited in my house. Apparently, he started yelling at the cop and punched him in the nose. The cop called for backup, and he was arrested for assaulting an officer. I was encouraged to press charges against him so he could do more prison time, and I had to testify in court. I ignored looking in his direction the entire time, and he got 4 years for criminal stalking and 8 for assault and battery for punching the officer. He's eligible for parole in 6 years, and I hope to this day that he won't be released early. But knowing that he's incarcerated is the only thing that has ever made me feel safe again. I don't know what he was planning by coming to my window so late at night, but I'm sure glad that I locked it. My name is Zane, and when I was 5 to about 9 years old, we lived in a house outside of Pittsburgh. I can only assume that the stuff I'm about to tell you happened before I started to notice, as I lived in this house from birth until I was 9 years old, but only started to notice things when I was about 5. My little brother at the time was 1, and it was the summer of 2003. My little brother's name is Miles, and the house that we lived in had 2 bedrooms, so naturally my parents lived in one and my brother and I shared the other. My dad worked in a steel mill, and my mum worked as a 3rd grade teacher at a local elementary school. So, I remember vividly that I was in the shower and I was already a little on edge as I had just started to shower alone without my parents' help. But I kept hearing someone knock on the door, and I would say, "Someone's in here," like obviously you can hear the shower. It happened probably like 3 or 4 times though, so eventually I got out of the shower soaking wet and naked and went to the bathroom door to see what was up. And when I opened the door, there was no one there. The only people home at the time were my babysitter Sarah and my little brother Miles. I remember walking out of the bathroom soaking wet with no clothes on, yelling, "Sarah!" and I finally found her in my room, putting my brother down for a nap, and I asked her why she knocked on the door, and she said that she didn't. So, naturally, I was a little creeped out, but not too scared, as my little brain just couldn't fully process what the hell was going on. Anyway, after that day, things just went on as normal for a while. Aside from little things that would happen here and there that were easy to brush off as coincidences. That is, until around Christmas that year. Actually, the day before Christmas. I remember this so well because it really still scares me to this day. I was sound asleep and I woke up randomly, and at first it just seemed like a routine wake-up in the middle of the night. Like a lot of 6-year-olds, if I woke up in the middle of the night, I would go to my parents' room and sleep with them. So, I tried my best to be really quiet as not to wake my brother in his crib. I always slept with the door open because I like to let a little light come in from the hallway. As I began to walk up to the door, I noticed that it was closed. which was really weird. And not only that, but when I walked up to the door and tried to open it, it was locked. I knew for a fact that I didn't lock it, and it could only be locked from the inside, and there's no way my 1-year-old brother could do it. So I brushed it off and unlocked the door and walked to my parents' room, a little weirded out. But the next part is what gave me chills. I was probably asleep in my parents' room for 2 or so hours before the baby monitor started going off. I rolled over and went back to sleep as my dad went to go and check on Miles. But not too long after this, I hear him come back into the room and he taps me on the shoulder to alert me, and he says, "Hey, did you lock the door to your room?" Obviously, I said no, and that it was locked when I woke up and came in here, and I unlocked it and left it open when I came to sleep with you guys. So, at this point, we were all just a little confused, and my dad is a little worried because my brother was essentially locked in our room, crying. It wasn't too bad because the doors were pretty easy to break into with a credit card, so my dad broke into it and got Miles out. And that was the end of the weirdness for that night. But my dad, and nor me, never forgot that, and we still talk about it sometimes to this day. So, after all of this, the activity stopped for about 2 years until I was 8, almost 9 years old. When I was 8 is when it started to get real bad. By this time, we had made renovations to the house and my brother and me had our own rooms. My room was right next to his on one of the hallways, and then my parents' room was on the other side of the house in an adjacent hallway. My birthday is on July 31st, and this event occurred probably around July 25th or so. My mum and dad were at dinner that night, so myself and Miles had a babysitter. It was a different babysitter than usual, as our usual one was on vacation, but she had babysat our neighbours, so I vaguely knew who this person was too. I was playing my PlayStation in the living room, and the babysitter, I can't really remember her name, but I think it was Erin or something, was playing with Miles in our nursery playroom. I remember I was playing an MVP baseball game that I was obsessed with at the time, but the TV started going in and out. It would go from the game to a solid blue screen, back to the game and back and forth, probably like 6 or 7 times. So I called Erin in and she just said to ignore it, and I was like, okay. I kept playing for probably another 10 minutes, and then it went to a blue screen again and made a real buzzing noise, and then just went black. I screamed at this point because, honestly, it sounded like the TV was about to explode or something. I went to turn the TV back on, and it was fine again. I played my game for probably another 5 minutes, and then it happened again. And this went on for 4 or 5 times before I just gave up on playing. Now, I know that may be insignificant to many people here. I mean, after all, it could have just been the electronics in the house or something, right? Well, the reason I tell you is because it was after this that the activity in the house just spiked. From this point on until the day that we moved out, 2 weeks later, the activity just didn't stop. Most of it was just typical door shutting and faint whispers that could be explained away. But the one night that made us leave and never come back was so much more than that. I think it's worth mentioning that I think that we all knew something was going on, but we never really mentioned it because I think that we were all just trying to pretend that it wasn't happening. But after this, it was impossible to ignore. We were all sitting on the couch watching a movie and eating ice cream in the living room, as we tended to do a lot on a Sunday night. And the lights in the kitchen started to flicker, so my dad went to check it out. He turned the light off as we didn't really need it and sat back down. But then, the light started flickering again, and we looked at each other, knowing exactly what was going on. But again, he got up and tried to fix it. He sat back down and we watched the movie for probably another 5 minutes before the light started to flicker this time, much more aggressively than before. And my dad went in there again in an attempt to screw the light bulb out. But just as he was reaching for the light bulb, it shattered and all the glass fell onto his face and onto the ground everywhere. And as soon as that happened, my little brother, who I think may have been a sort of target for whatever this was, began to scream really loud. At first, it came across as a pretty normal reaction to a light bulb exploding. But then, it got so loud that I have never heard a human scream like that before or since. The only thing I can compare it to is like the sound of a dog when you accidentally step on its toe or something, but an even higher pitch, and for like 30 seconds straight. We all knew right then and there for sure that it was definitely not a human scream. My parents at this point had had enough, and we just took my brother after he finished and went and stayed at our grandma's house that night. I know that this whole thing may come across as a little bit far-fetched, but if you had heard that scream, you would know exactly why we never returned to that house again after that day, and why I've never had a desire to go back there all these years later. For a very dark 5-year period in my life, I worked in what my employer called healthcare security, for a professional term. This is effectively a polite way of saying that my employer was a private contractor who rounded up a lot of local goons to serve as poorly trained, and oftentimes incompetent, security officers for numerous local hospitals and other healthcare facilities in our city. The job description stated that we protected the entire campus of whatever facilities that we were contracted to work for, and that was true to an extent. But the vast majority of the job took place in an emergency room and psych department. Daily assignments involved direct face-to-face interactions with drug addicts, chronic alcoholics, homeless people, individuals recently released from prison, violent criminals injured in conflicts with the police, and most notably, psych patients. Oftentimes, the people we confronted fell into more than one of the aforementioned categories. In addition to the dangerous patients that we dealt with, many of my own co-workers at the security contract company, they were worthy material themselves. Hypothetically, to work for this particular company, you had to pass a background check, a drug test, and obtain a merchant guard license from the city. I occasionally had access to the background check results of some of my co-workers, and it was rare to see anyone get hired with what I personally would have considered a passing result. Over the years, though, I witnessed a number of people get terminated for some really bizarre sexual assault and/or harassment situations, among a wide array of other generally unprofessional behavior. No doubt, several of these incidences would be worthy for this channel, but I'm not the victim of these stories, so I won't try to tell them. Luckily, the facility that I spent the most time working for was one of the better ones, and they actually had a very well-designed security program in place. The security program manager whom I worked for was a retired US Army artillery officer and a retired federal law enforcement agent, so he knew his stuff pretty well. To the best of his ability, he chased away the more obviously unethical or incompetent security officers, although the company would have just kept sending more of them no matter how many he got rid of. The hospital itself was a level 1 trauma center, and when it came to dealing with physical injuries, they were great. Psych patients, though, not so much. Every patient and visitor entering the hospital emergency department was searched for weapons. But to achieve this, there was always a minimum of 2 officers in the emergency department. One officer was always inside the emergency department itself, searching patients who arrived by ambulance. The other security officer ran a security checkpoint for anyone who came in under their own power, be that a patient or someone seeking to visit a patient. The checkpoint had a metal detector for people to walk through, and all bags had to be searched as well. It was similar to going through security at an airport, minus the cavity searches and no fly lists, of course. Additional security officers could be called upon from elsewhere in the facility as necessary too. So, this story takes place at approximately 2 a.m. on a graveyard shift when I was assigned as the security officer in the emergency department. The shift had gone smoothly for most of the night so far, when I received a radio call from the officer at the security checkpoint, demanding immediate assistance. There was an obvious tone of panic in her voice too, and I rushed to the security checkpoint quickly, expecting to be joining in on a fight with a methed-out homeless guy or something. When I arrived, I was initially confused because everything was quiet, and the officer at the checkpoint was just standing there, quietly examining something on the desk. On the desk in front of the security officer, I saw 3 bags, and I quickly realized that whatever was happening here, it was going to be more a cerebral experience than the typical homeless brawl. The bags I saw were of the following types. The first was a Nikon camera bag. I recognized the type of bag as being similar to one a photographer I knew carried. A bag like this often held a camera which could range in price from between $500 to $2,000 or more. The second was an extremely expensive leather briefcase, of the type that someone might use to carry both a laptop computer and a large stack of documents. And the third was a weatherproof storm case, of the same brand that we had used when I served in the military. Cases like these often held expensive electronic items or weapons even. It was a unique set of luggage to encounter in a hospital emergency room, that's for sure. But that alone wasn't what made the situation so shocking. All 3 bags were completely coated in multiple layers of blood. And when I say multiple layers of blood, what I mean is that there were clearly some different patterns in the blood that had ended up on these bags. Some of the blood was already dry and flaky, as if it had been there for a while. Some of the blood was damp and had a sort of matted texture to it, as if it had recently been rubbed onto the bags from some other surface or something. But most disturbing, there were small droplets of blood which were still obviously wet and looked as if they had dripped onto the bags within the last few minutes. Whatever the source of blood was, it was immediately obvious that these bags had been exposed to that source over a prolonged period of time. So naturally, I asked what the hell happened here. The security officer at the desk was nearly speechless, but as she attempted to explain to me that a moment before I arrived, a man had run into the building screaming and ranting. The man, like his bags, was completely covered in blood from head to toe. She wasn't able to understand most of what he said, but she recalled him mentioning a dog and someone kicking down the doors of his house. But when she asked to search his bags, he also admitted that there was a gun in the weatherproof case. Not knowing what else to do with the man, she sent him through to get checked in and kept his bags at the desk. And that was when she called me, hoping that I would know what to do next. Assuming that a situation this bizarre and blood-drenched must involve some kind of crime being committed, I didn't want to open any of the bags and possibly contaminate evidence or something. But we couldn't just let massive quantities of blood sit out in the open and frighten other patients either, so I grabbed a red biohazard bag and placed the 3 blood-soaked items into that bag to contain the mess. Then, I contacted a supervisor, which seemed the only logical course of action. The supervisor for that shift was actually a friend of mine, and a generally laid-back guy. After explaining what I had been told and had witnessed myself thus far, he agreed that we might need to call the police to report a possible crime. However, for better or worse, hospitals have to abide by some very strict privacy laws pertaining to patients, and what we can share with law enforcement about our patients is limited. So it was decided that we needed to at least talk to this blood-covered man and get a more coherent story out of him before taking any further action. Confronting him in his room in the emergency department, We were surprised to find that he was neither screaming nor ranting as he had previously been described. A later review of the CCTV footage would confirm that he had been way more animated when he first arrived. But now, he was completely calm. This actually made his demeanor even more disturbing though, as one does not expect a man covered in blood to be that calm. He proceeded to very confidently explain to us that he had tripped over a dog at his home, because the little bastard likes to hide under blankets. He insisted that the blood, which he admitted was an extreme amount, was from a very tiny wound on his head that he sustained after tripping over his dog. He may have hit his head on either a chair or his TV. He wasn't sure which one. He claimed that after being injured, he tried to lay down in bed, but the blood from his head had soaked all the way through a pillow without stopping, thus convincing him that he needed to seek medical attention. We didn't really buy his story, but we weren't cops and our power was really limited to enforcing hospital policies on our own property, so we didn't feel like we could directly accuse him of lying to us or anything. But his assigned nurse confirmed for us that the minor laceration on his forehead would not be sufficient to cause the amount of blood that we were seeing on him and his bags. Furthermore, as he was behaving in a completely calm and coherent manner with strong vital signs, he had no signs of significant blood loss, which further cast doubt on his claim that all of this blood was his. Our next question for the man was why he felt the need to bring so many bags with him to the hospital when he clearly felt that he had an emergency situation. This was a roundabout way of asking why he brought a gun with him too. His response was that he lived in a very dangerous part of the city and his house had recently been broken into. All of his windows had been smashed out and both the front and back door of the house had been kicked down. As such, he couldn't secure his home at all when he wasn't there. And he felt that if he left his valuables at home, then the thieves would come back while he was gone and steal everything that he had left. Hence, he had decided to bring all of his most expensive items, camera, computer, and gun, with him when he left the house. He even went off onto a side story at this point, claiming that someone had recently robbed him of $50,000 worth of antique silverware. Even though his stories had taken a turn from merely suspicious to outright bizarre, we kept pressing him, and our next question was if he would be willing to let us put his blood-drenched bags back in his car in the parking lot. We would usually hold pocket knives and other small items for people, but firearms and expensive items we would have to lock up in a safe, which we didn't want to do just in case because everything this man owned seemed to be perpetually covered in blood. Our usual procedure in situations like this, but typically less bloody, was to ask people to take their items back to their car. But, oh no, we couldn't do that, the man insisted. You see, the windows of his truck were broken out too, so the truck wasn't secure either. In fact, the doors on the cab of his truck were broken in such a way that they didn't even stay closed anymore on their own, so he had to chain them shut to keep them from flying open while he drove. By this point, the story had morphed from being suspicious to being totally crazy to finally being outright disturbing. A man covered in blood had literally just told us, in an eerily calm demeanor, that he has a habit of chaining doors shut. We couldn't resist the temptation to step out into the parking lot to inspect his truck for ourselves, though. It wasn't difficult to pick out which truck he had been talking about, too. It was an older model Chevy pickup truck, with badly worn-out white paint and a large pile of garbage in the bed of the truck, including open alcohol containers. As he had described, the driver's side and passenger side windows were missing and the doors were indeed held shut with some kind of elaborate jury rigging involving chains. Inside the cab of the truck, someone had ripped out large sections of the dashboard, leaving electrical wiring and mechanical components exposed. We later confirmed from CCTV footage that this was the truck the man had come from before entering the hospital too. But, as with the bags and the man himself, the most disturbing thing about this truck was the blood. The entire interior of the cab was drenched in even more blood than the man and his bags had been covered with. As with the bags, the blood seemed to be in layers here too. Some of the blood was already dried and was beginning to flake. Some blood was thick and matted, still damp but quickly drying. A lot of the blood was still clearly wet, however, including droplets that were falling from the roof of the cab, and a large pool of blood which was forming in what appeared to be a small storage space in the center of the console. The most notable thing, though, was the massive wave of blood which appeared to have been splashed onto the interior of the windshield, directly in front of the steering wheel. I have no idea how that truck got into our parking lot, because it would have been impossible for anyone to drive with that much blood covering the windshield. There was some blood on the exterior of the truck too, but in much smaller amounts. It was smeared in small streaks all around the vehicle, as if someone had walked in a circle around the vehicle and intentionally smeared those small streaks in random locations. Aside from that, and some natural-looking wear and tear, the vehicle had no other obvious exterior damage though. At this point, we notified the charge nurse for the emergency department, and she called the police to report the situation. It must have been a slow night, or the police were just very interested in seeing this for themselves, because multiple officers from the local police department showed up in only a few minutes. The first thing they wanted to see were the bags. I put on gloves and removed them from the red biohazard bag. The police looked at the bags, but that was all they did. They refused to open them or touch them at all, because they said the situation wasn't enough to give them probable cause to search the man's property without his permission. Next, the police spoke with the man. Their conversation went largely the same way that the conversation my supervisor had with the man earlier had gone. He repeated the same story about tripping over a dog, his house being broken into, and bringing his stuff to the hospital to safeguard it, all told in the same eerily calm demeanor. The police didn't seem to believe the story any more than we had, but they didn't accuse him of lying either. They didn't even write anything down, in fact. They just asked for his address, which he gave them, and then they said that they would have to contact the police department, which had jurisdiction over the city where his address was located. While they waited for a response from the other department, they went out to examine his truck and seemed as baffled by it as we had been. A short while later, one of the police officers spoke to us again to notify us of the outcome. Apparently, the other police department where the man lived had checked their records to see if any crimes had been reported at the man's house or if he had a prior record, but they found no evidence of any wrongdoing. And, believe it or not, that was it. Everyone just dropped it. But there wasn't even going to be an official report because they said that there was nothing to report. My supervisor and I were just totally mystified by the whole thing. We knew the local police were notoriously lazy and often unhelpful, particularly when it came to writing reports. But this was the most outrageous thing that we had ever seen them ignore by far. I flopped down at the security checkpoint and started writing my own report. At the very least, I wanted to make sure that we covered our own asses by showing that we had done our jobs, investigated this to the greatest degree that we were allowed to, and made every effort to report a possible crime to the police. Luckily, it was quiet at the checkpoint at this time of night, so I had plenty of time to assemble a detailed report, with images of the blood-drenched man and his truck attached to the report. While I was still working on the report, the man was discharged. He had cleaned himself up slightly, but his clothes were still stained with large quantities of blood. He had cleaned himself up slightly, but his clothes were still stained with large quantities of blood. He asked for his bags back, and I hauled them out from under the desk to hand them over. Before leaving, he declared that he needed to check the serial number on his weapon before leaving. He opened the plastic case right in front of me, and without taking the weapon out, he showed it to me in plain view. It was a beautiful 1911 handgun, completely clean, no blood on it or inside of the case, and the whole setup looked like it was brand new. And then he slammed the case shut, took his bags, and just disappeared back into the night from whence he came. And that was the last time that any of us ever saw the man drenched in blood.